Yes, indeed, folks. Let me tell you what I'm going to do for you, since we're rapidly running out of time. Bumper Edition Show! Since we don't actually have a Wild Things Considered today because Cat is off with his lovely wife in Paris, how very romantic of him. You know, it's got to show everyone else up, doesn't he? It's like, yeah, I'm going to Paris. How very romantic. I'm married. Well, so am I, but, you know, I didn't get to go to Paris. Meanie. So yes, Bumper Edition. I want to cut into their time slot. Ha! So I'm going to give you, from now, an extra half an hour of show. Hell yeah, let's do it. Yeah! Feeling up to it. Now, okay, let's do this. Now, my idea. So let's go back to my idea, because I didn't really get an adequate amount of time to explain it. This is what I get for rambling on. It's entirely my fault. Very unprofessional of me. I'm very, very sorry. So, now, let's actually talk about it.
It's over 9,000!
Which is why it's taking so long to talk about. You know, Vegeta understands. So, this dynamically generated non-linear raid content. Here we go. Let's go back to what we said. We took the idea of linearity, and we took the idea of non-linearity, and we debunked the idea that Nax or Black Temple or anything else was actually non-linear, because it wasn't. You had the same end boss, you had to start at the same place, just because you went through it in a different order didn't make a blind bit of difference. It didn't affect the instance in any way. Now, let's take these ideas. First off, we start with the branching, okay? So, we start with the one entrance. You go in that entrance, and you get a choice of two possible paths to start with. So it forks off, yeah? And you go down those paths. Now, you will find trash. And that trash is going to be something which is appropriate to the boss. Now, we've seen it before in Nax, it's very effective. We've also seen it in places like Zul'Gurub. But trash tends to be, most of the time, appropriate to the boss. So, we do that, but we take it to another level. We decide that the trash is going to be geared towards specific kinds of raids, okay? So maybe a melee-heavy raid will have trash which favors melee, or might require heavy melee, a lot of tanks, or a lot of melee DPS. Maybe they have innate spell resistance, stuff like that. So they go down that path, and they get a pretty clear impression of what the boss is going to spit out at them. So they get down the path, and they get into the room, and there's your boss. Now they pick one of two paths. These paths are mutually exclusive, okay? So, you run into the boss. Now, the boss is appropriate to the mobs that you just fought. So you've got a melee-friendly set of trash, you get a melee-friendly or melee-required boss. Now, what you can do, you can try and kill this boss. If you don't manage to kill it, you don't need to worry, because you can go and try the other one, okay? If it sucks, if it doesn't work, you can go and try the other one. Go back down the path, back to the start of the instance, and go up the other path and try the other one, you know? You could pretty much expand this infinitely. You don't have to just start with 2. You can start with 4, you know, depending on whatever. Now, take the idea of her car, yeah? And take the idea of the bug trio. These are all nice little things that they're like tiny little occurrences. They're like anomalies in the raid design. They're like testing grounds for concepts and mechanics. Stuff that's actually been put into the game, but then never really used again. So let's think about the bug trio for a minute. What happened to the bug trio? Those of you not familiar with the bug trio, here they were called Vem, Kree, and Yauj, as I remember correctly. No, Lord Kree, Princess Vem, Princess Yauj and Vem, yeah? And there were 3 bugs. And these bugs all had different abilities. Now, depending on the order in which you killed these bugs, depends on the loot that you got. Yeah, that changes. It changes depending on the order that you did them in. Now, that was a cool concept, and I liked that. There were certain orders that were more difficult than others and favoured certain raid setups. But some of the gear that you could get from it was pretty cool. Now, that's a concept for you. Now, I've already explained how her car works, so let's mix it up. Let's take those concepts and see how they would work together. So, you've gone down there, and say you've killed the first boss. Now, once you kill that boss, and you've proved that you can kill that boss, here's what happens. The gate to the other path closes. Yeah? So you cannot get through until next reset. You have proved that you can kill this boss. So, then we go on. Now, that does not mean that that entire path is locked off. Far from it. At some point in the instance, what I believe should happen is that you should be able to switch paths and go onto a different path. You'll have a crossover and you'll be able to go there. And it really depends on the boss. So there'll be certain bosses that favour certain things. Now, depending on the bosses that you killed, depends on the abilities that the end boss has. But you can't take them all away this time. It's not like a car. You can't kill all the bosses and have the end boss get really weak. You can take away certain abilities. And the way that you want to try and balance it is so that it favors certain kinds of raids. So say, if you have a melee heavy raid, you want to take away his ability to cleave, or you want to take away his ability to war stomp, or you want to take away his close range AoE, or his ability to mitigate basic physical damage. If you have a magic heavy raid, you want to reduce his resistance to magic. You want to get rid of his AoE counterspell, or his mana burn, or anything like that. But you can't do both. Okay? So you're going to have all these different abilities this boss can do, and you're going to be able to take away maybe roughly half of them. We'll start with the basics. We won't go into, hey, let's do 4 bosses per tier of this instance until you get to the end boss. Let's not do that. Let's start with something simple. So, you got your path. Let's say, in this instance, there are 12 bosses, yeah? Your first boss, everyone kills, yeah? He's your treasure boss, he's your loot boss, he's your reward for getting in there. Then you get your split off, and you get 5 bosses on each side. Now, there will be several opportunities to cross. You won't be able to do it all the time, you won't be able to swap every time, so there will be a magnitude of decision-making, You will have to perhaps miss out on some loot. You perhaps will have to miss out on this perfect combination of abilities. Let's say you're only allowed to cross 3 times, and there's 5 bosses, okay? So you can cross between the paths and you can do the bosses. Now, obviously each boss is going to have a different loot table, and each boss is going to have different abilities. And the gate is only going to close off when you kill that boss. When you prove that you can kill the boss with whatever ability, and it stops you from getting stuck. Yeah? Because if you kill the wrong combination of bosses, you could end up getting completely shafted. Which is why you associate, and this was an idea of someone on Vent, so I'm going to thank whoever it was, I cannot remember your name, please tell me in IRC, and I will credit you on this idea, that the bosses have abilities which suit particular styles of raid. So therefore, if you can kill the boss, you should be able to kill the end boss, yeah? That's the idea. So you never screw yourself over that way. If you encounter a boss you can't beat, then you get a chance to swap over, because the gates don't close until the boss is entirely and completely killed. Now, what happens at the end? Well, you get different versions of the last boss, and it's all, whole manner of different things. You could link this up quite nicely. You really could. You could come up with all sorts of different cool lore reasons for it. You could do all of this cool stuff with it, and the end boss would not only have different abilities, but different loot, depending on what. Now, this is a cool thing, because you can also tailor the loot to the kind of raid that you've got. If you've got a melee heavy raid, you can make sure that the melee heavy loot table comes into effect. You've killed the melee friendly bosses. You've got the melee friendly end boss. He drops lots of melee loot. Say if he's dropping 4 or 5 pieces of loot. You don't have to have it all be melee loot. You don't have to have it all be rogue swords or whatever. But you can influence it. You got more rogues, you got a melee heavy raid. So okay, let's let them do that. Let's let them be rewarded for that. Because that's a viable style of play. If you've got a magic heavy raid, a ranged caster heavy raid, let's do that too. We've got a healer heavy raid. Let's let them do that as well. Have a boss that requires a lot of healing that couldn't otherwise be done unless you had a healer heavy raid. And then we get healing gear drop at the end. There's so many different possibilities, and the great thing about this is that it's a concept that is infinitely expandable. You could effectively create an instance that would never be the same way twice. You could really mix it up, and it would be really fun. Now, in my opinion, this is the direction that raiding has to go, because raiding is good. It's good, but there hasn't been an awful lot of evolution. We saw evolution, the most of the evolution, at least in my opinion, happened in legacy content. Yeah? Most of the concept that we're seeing now were laid down in Blackwing Lair, AQ40, and Naxxramas. Yeah? Of course, with a little bit of AQ20 and Zul'Gurub thrown in there for good measure. So that's where you got the content from, that's where you got the mechanics, that's where you got the ideas from. And it was good. Whereas Burning Crusade introduced some cool new mechanics, but it certainly didn't innovate anywhere near as much as legacy content did. I think it's reaching a point where maybe they can't innovate anymore in their standard format, and they've got to mix the format up. They've got to make the raid instances more dynamic. And in my opinion, that would be a very cool thing to do. Really. I would absolutely enjoy doing that. It would be a lot of fun. And I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. WoW's strength has always been raiding. You can take the concept of raiding and make it available for all. The 10 to 25 man tier system, if done correctly, will allow for this. I'm still not entirely of the opinion that 10 and 25 man raid should be 10 man easy, 25 man hard. I don't think that's the way it should be. I think small form raiding should be challenging. And indeed, Zul'Aman demonstrated that there can be some challenging encounters, and there can also be some challenging challenges. Yeah, that's redundant, isn't it? Department of Redundancy Department. Mr. Redundant speaking. How may I redundantly take your redundant call? it's had some challenges in there that were not just down to killing bosses. They were down to killing bosses at a certain speed. You can integrate that into the system too. Now, that's the cool thing about this system. You can integrate all of these different elements. Take the speedrun element, put it in there, integrate that into the non-linear raid instance. And then you've got a situation whereby all of these different factors come into effect, and everything you do within the instance is not just about killing bosses anymore. It's about how fast you kill bosses, how well you kill bosses, and which bosses you decide to kill. And the amount, the kinds of people that you bring along to your raid, it's going to cater for a lot more of that. If you have a guild that is heavy on certain classes, you can bring them. So that will allow for guilds who are perhaps skilled but are lacking in certain kinds of players to still complete the instance. You don't have to make the instance easier. That's the nice thing about this concept. You don't have to make the instance easier in order to accommodate for guilds that perhaps don't have the optimum class balance. All you need to do is vary it up and make sure that the bosses that you are able to encounter will actually allow you to take a melee heavy or a ranged heavy or a healer heavy raid or a tank heavy raid, because you're going to get the choice of which bosses you take, and you're going to be able to tailor your end instance encounter to your raid. It's still going to be challenging, it's still going to be hard, but it's not going to be totally unfair. It's not going to say, no, you can't do this unless you have this, this, and this, because that's something that needs to go. This is something that we're going to be seeing back in Naxxramas, as you might imagine, particularly with 25-mans. You're going to be looking at dealing with the 4 horsemen. I don't know how they've changed the 4 horsemen, but if you remember back in the day, in 45-man raiding, I wish, 40-man raiding, you had the 4 horsemen requiring 8 tanks. Now that's pretty unreasonable, that's a pretty unreasonable requirement there, and it was a rooster block for a lot of people, for that reason. Get rid of that concept. That's an old school concept, and yeah, I don't care if the encounter was good, and it was. It doesn't matter, because that was an old school concept, and it really got in people's way. And that's not a good thing. It's an artificial block. It's not got anything to do with the skill of your raid, or the experience of your raid, or how good your guild is. It's about having 8 geared tanks, and that's not easy. That's not easy for any guild, even the Uber guilds. Most people tend to try and gear out 2 or 3 tanks pretty well, because that's the best thing. If one's off, okay. But you can't spread your gear around so much. It took a lot of farming to get the kind of gear that you needed to do that. Throw that out of the window and take this new concept, whereby you can tailor the encounters to your liking. And then you can have really challenging encounters with requirements, and then you can say that that's alright, because you're not forcing people to do it. It's like, you want an 8 tank encounter? Okay. But don't force people to do that 8 tank encounter. Force them to do it if they have 8 tanks, because if they have 8 tanks in their raid, and I can't imagine why they would, but let's just, hypothetically say that they had 8 tanks in their raid, and that's the boss they're going to be able to kill to get past the tiers. You've got your little branching thing, and you're going to tier your content off, and it's like, okay, first boss, and then you got the boss in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. No, it doesn't. Not equating to gear. Get that out of your mind. Tier actually means another thing. It's actually being ground into your head as meaning gear in WoW, but that's not necessarily true. So have a look at it. Have a think about it. You've got your level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and you can only pick 1 out of each of those levels. And if you have 8 tanks, take the boss that requires 8 tanks, and it's going to tailor the endgame encounter to be friendly to raiders that have 8 tanks in their raid for some inexplicable and highly implausible reason. But it doesn't matter, because having a optimally balanced raid shouldn't be as important as being good raiders. That should be the most important factor. Particularly now that you're throwing in yet another class into the mix, it might be even more difficult for people to get the appropriate kind of balance in their raid in order to take on the really difficult raid content. Sure, going to extremes is pretty silly. It's like you can't go in there with 24 healers and 1 tank and expect to win an encounter. No, let's be reasonable here. Let's use a bit of common sense. But, top-heavy raids, or raids that are just imbalanced in one way or another because they have a shortage or a glut of a particular class, they should not be necessarily penalised if they raid well. And this system could allow for loads of variety, loads of replayability. And it's funny because WoW has always been a game that's been very replayable, but has it actually been for the reasons of the game or because of the social aspect of it? Traditional game designers don't have that luxury. They don't have the luxury of people playing the game for 100, 200, 300 hours unless they add longevity to it, additional content, and replayability. WoW inherently has it, which is kind of an unfair fight, let's face it. But it would be nice for them to actually put something in the game which would be genuine, classic, old-school style replayability within raiding. Because raiding is something you do a lot of, and raiding is something that you're going to continue to do a lot of, I think, unless they decide to go down the PvP route, in which case, I'll see you in Warhammer Online. My name is Total Biscuit, and this is Blue Please here on WoW Radio. I'm going to play you one last track before the final section, which is, of course, the one and only Illusion of Choice. I love this track. This is in celebration of the game that I'm not going to buy because it's got horrible DRM on it. You'll know it when you hear it. Enjoy.